Oh, well, thank you both. So, Liam, let me start with you. I mean, I think it's really significant and important, as I said, that the ACTU sort of kicked off this campaign early in this term. I think democracy is a participation event. I think that, and if people aren't seeing the social media stuff that Unions Australia are putting out, it's really simple. It's great messaging. If you want to, again, realise that you're not the only one thinking about tax, I think the social media stuff there is brilliant. What do you think it will take to shift the politics towards doing something that our polling says is overwhelmingly popular, but will be resisted by some very powerful entitled industries? What are the ACTU crazy here, or what's going on?
Well, I won't answer the question as to whether we're crazy. I think I'll leave it to others to answer that. But I think to pick up on your point, politics is a participation event. We have a unique window. I think I came in at the end of Ingrid's speech about the opportunity that's before us. If we look back at this period in time, in a decade or more, this will be the moment where we start to shift the dial on tax reform. I think we should be congratulating the government what they did in the last term about how they did, to your point, re-engineer $80 billion of tax cuts back towards working people. I think putting working people front and centre here. I think this is about choices. We need to make it clear in this country about who pays their fair share. We have a huge reliance when it comes to revenue on working people and income tax. And these are the exact measures that we think are ripe for the picking. So, I mean, I think from our movement's perspective, this is something that we want to prioritise in this term of government to ensure that we get better tax reform, to your point, that we do start to lift the rate of revenue that the federal government is able to turn into, good, sustainable, quality services that Australians really should be expecting, if not demanding. But it's going to require people to pay more. And we think the gas industry have been getting away with a huge con on the Australian people. And so I think from a revenue point of view, I think it's fundamentally important. I think the other part to the narrative that needs to be called out more is the fact that, really what this has done is it's perversely linked our domestic gas prices to international markets. And so we have got a real tipping point on our hands when it comes to heavy industry in this country. And I think this is a huge part where actually I think many of those employers, those businesses need to get off the fence and start talking about the fact that we've really allowed our gas markets to be highly distorted. And whilst a levy will go some way, a reservation would go further. We think this is a huge area that we should be bringing a broader coalition of people together.
Well, I'm excited to say sitting up the front here is Jeff Crittenden, who'll be speaking this afternoon, a representative of manufacturing employer groups who, agree 100% with what the ACTU are saying and, of course, with what a lot of environment groups are saying. So to be crystal clear, part of events like this is for people to realise that we're not operating in neoliberal silos. Good policy, as Ingrid said before, should be good politics. So, Ingrid, the first question you got from the audience was, sure, right, yeah, carbon tax, as if. But, you've just heard Liam say, well, this is the time to push. How do you feel hearing Liam and the ACTU say, well, I think now's a good time to push for big tax? Does that make you more or less optimistic?
A long pause. Cool, and no mic. Got a mic? So I absolutely, I really do think that it's a cliche, but this is our window for a couple of reasons. One is just approaching this very practically. We have on the environment, we have a really finite window to get this right and to land this, and that has huge repercussions. That's about whether or not the international community as well sees Australia as doing its fair bit and treats us as a credible participant in global decarbonisation, which will benefit the Australian economy and workers and people. So we have to engage with that debate as credible participants that are engaged with the hard policy versus politics trade-offs we're talking about. If we cannot stare down the politics to get good policy up now, that window will close and we can't reopen it because this is a question of timelines. So that's, I think there's a sort of, I don't know if that's optimistic or fatalistic. I don't think it matters whether I'm optimistic or not. This is our opportunity. This is when we land it or we don't. And the scale of the task is such that we have to be really clear about that. And we can fudge that landing and fudge our international credibility, and we can squander revenue opportunities in the meantime, or we can land it solidly. We can have clear targets. We've got targets now that helps, I think. We've got the 2035 goals locked in, and that is gives us something very precise to work towards. So I think that's helpful. And we have most likely we have the window of government opportunity for a couple of terms to bed this in. And I think that's important too. I would say that, this politics versus policy thing, this tension is something we're all grappling with here in the room, or we wouldn't be here. I think, the point has been made so clearly that this is a competition for people's attention, for their care factor. And I think that there are, I think the work that you do, turning those kind of revenue numbers into something that's really tangible is important as we think about how we communicate what this means. So, I know that I could tell, members of my family, people I speak to frequently about this stuff, X many billions, and it's so abstract. Most people have no idea how many billions are floating around in a budget. It's pretty niche. Like I said, I like spreadsheets, so that's my game. But most people know. So we have to, I think, really make people appreciate the scale of the challenge, the urgency of the challenge, but also what it means for them, right? This is what it's about. And so revenue is not abstract. It's not wonky. It's not, purely the purvey of accountants and financiers. This is the stuff that enables a good quality of life. And the work you've done does an excellent job highlighting that. And I think that that's really the task we have to grab and to run with and to prosecute as hard as we can.
Thank you. So, Liam, you specifically talked about housing today as being one of the things that a government could do. And of course, we're talking about could. It's up to governments to decide what their priorities are. Can you give us an insight into, from the ACTU's point of view, why housing? I mean, I can think of a few good reasons, but what's behind that for the ACTU?
Speak to anybody under the age of 40 and it's pretty easy why you see housing is the number one thing that everyone is talking about. It's a huge crisis we have in this country. It's a crisis that I got to say other countries are also dealing with. But as we know, in particular, since we allowed the speculation on property, we have seen this massive issue rise over really a generation around housing affordability. And so I think linking things like tax reform, revenue reform, back to sort of meaningful outcomes is a great way, to your point, about how do we bring people with us? How do we talk about not just the inequity of allowing major foreign gas companies to exploit our natural resources, really to line their own profits that both distorts domestic markets, puts industry in a precarious position, but also doesn't solve any of the national crises that we've got. So housing is, in our opinion, like the first, second and third most salient issue when we talk to people under the age of 40. It is outrageous that a country as wealthy as Australia has essentially abandoned the idea that for anyone under the age of 40, the idea of owning your own home is completely out of reach. I think this is something that when we talk about intergenerational equity, being able to put a roof over your head is the sort of first fundamental human right that we should be guaranteeing for Australians. And so I think, to your point, Richard, it's about linking, the reform to the outcome. And, we've got to do a lot of things. It's not just about revenue. We've got to end the speculation in relation to property. We've got to think about how we can really lift supply as well. We've had, skills, education, training in this country completely smashed such that we don't have skilled workers to be able to help build us. Like, all of these things take serious decisions of government and significant revenue to turn it around. We need to start to turn those scales around, and we think pointing back to housing, not just important for our movement, but for all progressive causes. When we think about intergenerational equity, this is the first thing we should be starting to tackle.
Ingrid, is the Superpower Institute talk about what the money could or should be used for? Or and before you answer, I guess at the Australia Institute, we go out of our way to talk about revenue and then say, so you figure out what you want to spend it on. Now, as a think tank, that's easier. Like, if you want to run for office, people want to know what you're going to do with it, which is why I think the ACTU focus on housing is so interesting. So to be clear, what we do at the Institute is try to broaden the menu that people can choose from and say, it's a democracy. You figure out your priorities. But from the Superpower Institute's point of view, what do you think about the debate about what to do with the money? Is that part of the equation, or are you just on the revenue side?
We certainly think about how that revenue can be spent. There's a balancing act, right? Of course, the economy shifts through time, and you don't want to tie government's hands either. You get a COVID come along and priorities shift. So on one hand, you want to be sort of clear that a lift in revenue is all else equal, very helpful, because it helps you respond to shifting needs and to challenges that perhaps you didn't anticipate properly. So that there's very good reason to sort of signal, to gesture towards the revenue without being overly prescriptive about how governments should spend it. But there are some things that we consistently point to, and some of them are essentially non-negotiable. So the big and the obvious one is around compensation for households. And as I said earlier, with a particularly keen eye on lower income households. So it is true, of course, that when you tax carbon, you push up the cost of energy for households. And what you need to do is make sure that when you do that, of course, that price signal is helpful. It helps steer people's decisions. Maybe it's the difference between driving versus not driving to the shops, or going twice a week instead of 4 times a week. That's how we gradually grind out those emissions that are embedded in our economy. The price signal is important, but you need to create that price signal without making people materially worse off for several incredibly important ethical and moral reasons, but also political reasons, right? So I think it's very useful to be precise about the form that compensation takes, a willingness to think about overcompensation as well, as people get used to the concept because it is a change. And I think there's lots of really interesting work that is being done around the sort of the policies that are meaningful to households around that. So, for example, sometimes, you get more, and it differs, of course, by group, not my speciality, but incredibly important to think about whether or not households do want cash back, or whether they do want lower prices, or whether they do want solar panels on their roof. These are, questions about how you bring people along with you while making sure that the absolute benchmark is that it doesn't reduce the welfare of households, but particularly lower income and vulnerable households. We also at the Superpower Institute do consistently talk about this question of addressing other market failures. So we have, of course, the missing carbon price in Australia, but there is a missing carbon price internationally as well. That reflects, the fact that the progress towards international agreements around decarbonisation is a bit of a stop-start affair. It's obviously buffeted by the winds of international politics. The direction is clear, though. And so, Australia does need to be thinking about what happens next. We've got ongoing productivity challenges. We will lose our fossil fuel export revenues. And we need to focus on the industries where Australia can prosper over the coming generations. And we're extremely fortunate that the same forces, the same international decarbonisation forces that will progressively reduce our revenues from fossil fuel exports, are the same forces that will create green export industries in Australia, because we have such remarkable potential for zero carbon energy. And so we're at this point where, and it is tricky, right? You're trying to anticipate how the international community will move. You're trying to do make the investments that are needed now, and perhaps provide support where it's judicious and sensible to get those industries up, so that when there is a market for them, and there are markets merging, absolutely, we're ready. And so we also talk at the Superpower Institute about devoting some of those revenues to that to that goal of the longer term prosperity, looking around the corner, because that's what Australia has always done. We have prospered generation after generation on the back of our remarkable natural resources. Whether it's been gold or wheat or wool, most recently mining, they all required huge levels of investment, mix of private and public, of course. We stand on the cusp and the potential of being able to do that again if we can get the policies right. And so, I don't think, and of course, you have to be judicious, right? You get revenue in, you can't throw it away, because social priorities, environmental priorities, and long-term economic priorities. But you can use that judiciously to set up the next generation. And we should. We have an obligation to do that.
Okay, we're going to throw to some questions for the audience. And again, they're going to be questions, not comments. There's a few microphones walking around. Dee, we might start there with a quick question that's not a comment.
Yes. In your talk, Ingrid, you mentioned the problems for the Australian government having to have sustainable budget. I'm wondering if it's time we stopped asking that question. Josh Frydenberg has told us that we can buy anything if it's a priority. Could the Australian government really ever go bust? Is there really a scarcity of funds? Perhaps we should be thinking of taxes as a way of giving us a civilist society by charging those who live in it. And oil and gas companies are destroying their business model because we don't want oil and gas. Right? The laws of physics say we're heading for a crisis, a climate crisis. Why do we persist in requiring budget surpluses and government budget sustainability?
So here, I think I do think that there are important reasons to focus on a sustainable budget, not least that I do think that we are in an unusual era at the moment because we have relatively low interest rates at the moment. We've been able to accumulate a relatively high level of debt per GDP through the recent period without having crushing debt repayment problems on the budget's bottom line. It is the case that when you sort of live through sustained years of deficit, you acquire debt repayments and they come good. So I do think that we need to, and maybe I'm a pretty conventional economist on this one. I do think we need a sustainable budget, not least because it means that we're not dealing with a scarcity mindset. We're not forever scrabbling for funds to push forward the things that we want on the social and the environmental agenda. So I do strongly support policies that bring in revenue on the kind of scales that we've been talking about today. And I think putting them towards very clear long-term social and environmental projects and economic projects. But for me, I will, I do think sustainable budgets are important.
G'day, Luke Whitington from Search Foundation. Thanks for your both of your insights. This is primarily for Liam, but of course, Ingrid, if you've got some comments as well. So it was long-term sustained strategic action by the Australian Union Movement that won us Medicare and the superannuation. What can you give us some insights into what the strategy will be for the Union Movement to win the 25% tax on LNG exports, particularly for those of us who are not right now working in the Union Movement, so how we can help and contribute to that strategy, and how you've mentioned some of the allies that you might be able to enrol in that campaign.
Well, I think, you're right, and Richard touched on it before. We're not going to win it just on snappy social media, although I'm constantly reminded by young people how important TikTok and other things are. But I think the other important thing that you raise is we're not going to win it on our own. Like, this is something that needs to be a concerted effort. Yes, from our movement, 1.6 million working people who are organised in our community want to see stronger action in relation to budget, increased revenue, but also in terms of addressing, the inequity issues around how we collect tax. I do think it's about building a broader coalition. I think the people in this room have agency in doing that, whether you represent industry or whether you represent other parts of civil society. This is an issue that we should all be horrified about. You know, a 25% levy on exports is something that we think, and you tested it, does cut through across the community. And so I think my call to people in this room is to work with us to join the campaign around this. I do think, these sorts of efforts will only happen with a concerted push from everybody in the community because, to your point, Medicare, was won by the trade union movement. It was snuffed out by a Liberal government and returned only many years later. And we want to ensure that we don't have that problem here. This needs to be something that is unequivocal, that we use the opportunity that potentially a long-term progressive government can offer us in terms of embedding reforms. And now is the window to do it.
Let me just add something to that. I mean, again, one of the reasons to have a revenue summit is to make people realise they're not alone thinking about revenue. And the Australian Institute, like the ACTU, we're not just interested in taxing gas. And indeed, the ACTU are pushing for changes in capital gains tax and negative gearing. But I do think that gas presents a unique political opportunity in modern Australian history. To simplify, this industry is overwhelmingly foreign-owned. It pays zero tax in many instances, and we can all get lollies if they pay some tax. All right? Usually we think of winners and losers. The losers here literally don't vote. Okay? Let's just tidy this up as much as we possibly can. In a democracy, disagreement is fine. We invented parliaments to resolve democratic disputes. We don't all have to agree. But it's pretty rare that an opportunity comes along to say, hey, people who don't vote, how's about you give us $20 billion a year? What's to disagree with?
Can I?
Now, but just to be clear, the reason it's hard is because our democracy is quite captured. And that's why we have to be careful to not think, if we put up a strong enough economic argument, we'll win. We have to put up a strong economic argument. We have to put up a strong democratic argument. But we also have to understand we're not really arguing against fellow voters or economists. This is just power. But its power, is only as powerful as we believe it to be. And if our elected representatives fear people who can't vote more than fear people who can vote, well, that's a bit of a problem. But to be clear, this is a unique tax reform opportunity because we're literally giving them our resources for free and they're a bit sad that we might stop. Then whether we can organise to win that or not, time will tell. But put on another way, if you can't win this fight, I don't know what fight we can win. Sorry, Ingrid.
I was just going to add not everything you said, but also it's the case that, they're extracting and producing and selling resources owned by all of Australians. But when those resources are shipped overseas and combusted overseas, Australians also bear the direct cost of that in the form of more frequent bushfires and floods and droughts and rising temperatures. So, there are economic arguments to tax rents generally. But I think that the case is particularly compelling when it comes to fossil fuel exports, because it's not the case that when those exports leave our waters, we wave them goodbye. Well, we do financially, but then they revisit us in the form of floods and drought and bushfires and rising temperatures, right? If there is not a case there to recover money so that we can think about measures to support adaptation to those rising temperatures, we know that the people who will be hit hardest by global warming are the ones that are already the most vulnerable. That should inform our thinking about this. There is a moral case as well as an economic case here, I think. And I think that is something that just because it's quite abstract, right? Like the things leave in a ship and they go overseas over the horizon, and perhaps we don't think about them again. That's very natural. I think the thing we can do is also really emphasise the relationship between what those exports mean for Australians across all walks of life and all regions, because it has a repercussion.
Oh, look, agree. And some people here know we run a climate integrity summit once a year, and very much the focus is on these moral questions. But perhaps back to you, Liam. I mean, in the lead up to World War II, it was the union movement questioning whether selling iron and steel to Japan to turn into weapons to fight a war against us was a good idea. I understand, they're not mutually exclusive, but is that moral dimension part of the union campaign here as well?
Well, look, I mean, Federated Ironworkers, my old union, again, pig iron, absolutely. I think that was an issue. I'll answer that question, but I also want to supplement what you said. I think you're absolutely right. These are corporations that don't vote, but we've seen what's happened in our history. I mean, we all remember the mining tax. These people will mobilise a hell of a campaign. They will talk about how this is a huge sovereign risk. They'll talk about how much jobs and so on are tied into it. This is where I think the opportunity really lies to actually talk about the distortion of our gas markets and the threat that they are posing to many workers across the country that rely upon that as an input cost. And not to discount the climate angle, I think there is a conversation to be had with workers across a whole range of industries about how this is disturbing our domestic gas markets. But absolutely, I think, we need to think about Australia's role in the world and the impact that our export of gas will have on the future of the planet. We will be back here next week. We are launching our climate and health and safety report. The fact of the matter is, workers are on the front line of those bushfires. Workers are on the front line when it comes to heat, flood, fire. We've just seen a horrendous picture painted for the future when we think about the climate risk assessment that was released last month. Those are workers. 45 days in many of our cities every year, it will be too hot to work outside. That might be fine for every one of us that get to retreat to air-conditioned buildings every day, but 1 in 3 workers work some or all of their time outside. What are they going to do? So I agree. I think there is a conversation. I think what's really important about this is we've got to inoculate people, I think, to what the counter-campaign will be. And this is where I think there's a great conversation to be had about how not only are they exploiting our resources and not paying for us, but they're distorting our markets that we rely upon. I mean, this is the craziness of Australian industrial policy, like how we could give away this huge resource that could have, sustained some industry here for a long time. I find, as someone that comes from that sector, really galling.
Just briefly on the politics, which Ingrid touched on before, of introducing the carbon price, it always strikes me when the carbon price was introduced, there was enormous thought went into compensation for households and compensation for industry. And, unfortunately, Tony Abbott waged a successful scare campaign. The carbon price was repealed. But what people don't, I think, realise, and it's not linked up in our history, is that it was only in 2015 that we started exporting gas from the East Coast. And when we made the policy decision to let gas companies export gas, the price of wholesale gas tripled. The wholesale price of gas went up 300%, with not a cent in compensation for households and not a cent in compensation for industry. And while we had this enormous turmoil about, how will the carbon price harm industry? How will the carbon price harm households? We were just assured that the tripling of the wholesale price of gas would be fine. Well, as Jeff will talk about this afternoon, it's not fine for manufacturing. It's not fine for people who saw electricity and other prices go up. But I bring this up to remind you how carefully and strategic the business community are in their scare campaigns. Because when they wanted to cause a scare campaign about the carbon price, we all got pre-primed to fear these price increases, which were compensated for most people. But when they saw enormous profits from tripling our gas price, don't worry, it'll be fine. Now, the fun part for me is if we are brave enough to unscramble this omelette, is that if we were to simultaneously start taxing the gas industry and phasing in a carbon price, we would have so much cash for the compensation. we would just be swimming in the former tax-free profits of the gas industry. So a lot of people kind of think that the way to do policy is one thing at a time because we're very busy. I would actually argue there's huge opportunities to start multiple debates at the same time here, because while I do think we should tax the gas industry because giving away gas for free is one of the dumbest things you can do, in the plain speaking words of Nobel Prize winner Joe Stiglitz, you'd have to be brainless to do this. Not only is it a good idea, but I think pushing the gas industry backwards, showing that they're not all powerful, will actually make it easier to introduce other necessary reforms. Now, we've probably got time for one more question, and I think I will come here because it did catch my eye earlier, but we are going to wrap for an early lunch soon, and we've got an hour off, and I don't want to cut into chatting to people time.
Ingrid, what impact do you think there'll be on the politics of a possible carbon price from the EU's statement that it's going to, in effect, put a carbon tax on exports that are not taxing in the domestic, at home? And I understand that there'll be other jurisdictions that are thinking of that too.
For sure. So just quickly, I might explain the context for the question because it's a little techie. So the question is about what's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is has just been introduced in the EU. What that means is that while the EU has for years now had a carbon price in place, they're progressively introducing a carbon price at the border. The reason they're doing that is, of course, that their domestic producers are otherwise competing with imports that don't pay for a tax on carbon, and it's being ratcheted up. It sort of is going to hit full force in 2034, and at the same time they're reducing free permits for producers within the EU. So the idea is to equalise the carbon cost burden for domestic EU producers and internationally. So what that means is that if an Australian product, or any product really, but is sent into the EU, that the carbon embedded in those goods will be priced at EU carbon prices, rising progressively through time. Now, it's a complex policy, so it will be introduced progressively and initially will apply only to relatively simple products, so things like rolled steel and electricity, energy, cement, all of the energy intensives really. And then the goal is to progressively build that out to more complex products. Turning then to the question of what that means for Australia. So first of all, I think that there's sort of a general rule we can take from the EU experience, and that's that wherever there is a carbon price, a CBAM will follow. So any government that's pricing carbon domestically has an incentive to introduce that CBAM, so they're not, or an equivalent policy, so they're not disadvantaging their own producers. And carbon prices are increasingly cropping up at different levels, but around the world. So Japan has recently is formalising their voluntary into a legislated emissions trading scheme. China has expanded theirs. Prices are relatively low but increasing. And so what we should expect is that as carbon prices emerges, CBAMs will follow for domestic political reasons, very sensible reasons. And so I sort of think of the European Union CBAM as, the first insight into what we should expect here. Now, Australia doesn't export much in the way of the taxed products directly to Europe. The way it's most likely to affect Australia is through things like the fact that we export iron ore, which is processed typically in Northeast Asia, which is then shipped into Europe, either directly as a product or as a finished item, manufactured item, cars, white goods, the like. So we can expect a sort of a pass-through effect from that. But I think the most direct effect that Australia will experience from the CBAM is not actually through existing products, but the market it creates for our potential zero-carbon export industries. So if you think about, that price coming online, hitting EU prices in the early to mid-2030s, what that means is all of a sudden, things like green iron have scope to compete with conventional iron. So conventional iron is incredibly carbon intensive. So on average, it's like 2.2 tons of carbon emissions per ton of steel globally. So if you think about putting the EU's carbon price on that, in 2030, that's about 150 Australian dollars-ish, different forecasts, whatever. But that's huge. So all of a sudden you create a market for green exports. And so I actually think that the main effect for Australia will be less on our current exports because we don't do much direct shipping of energy intensives to Europe, mainly because we don't produce them. But it creates a market for the green exports. And that's why it's so exciting.
Just briefly, because if it's anything like a union meeting, standing between you and lunch is pretty dangerous. But just, I think the point I want to raise is it is crazy this country is potentially going to have exporters that are going to face a CBAM and not do it themselves. Why would we trade that revenue to foreign countries where we could collect it at our own border as it's leaving? So setting aside Europe, the fact that Japan, huge taker of our gas, is considering a carbon price that will follow with a CBAM, why wouldn't we do something that's going to collect the revenue? These exporters are going to pay it. It's about whose pocket it goes in, and I'd far rather it going in our pocket than those countries.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We're about to break for lunch. Please be back at 12:30. We've got Saul Estlake straight up after lunch, and we've stuck to time this morning. We need to start on time after lunch. But can you please, before you head off, give Ingrid and Liam another round of applause?
Thanks for watching, and a very special thank you to all our supporters who help keep us running. We're not funded by political parties or fossil fuel companies or government, but by people like you who know the importance of evidence-based research in shaping the critical decisions facing Australia. If you'd like to support us to continue exposing inconvenient truths, challenging vested interests, and explaining the big issues in plain English, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au to find out more.